Hello everyone, this video will cover how I went about creating this project for university. And as an extra challenge, we're then going to go on to reproduce it with grease pencil. At the beginning of this year, I started studying a Bachelor of Animation at UB colleges, and it's been a lot of fun. I've done lots of little projects which have culminated in this assignment, one of my first 3D animations. Starting off, I gathered some references. I wanted the project to have a stop motion effect similar to Wallace and Gromit or this amazing video from Worthy Kids, as well as some other awesome projects. Before getting into the production, I wanted to get some style testing done. Following this tutorial from Southern Shotty on YouTube, and doing some of my own tweaking, I came up with this little scene. From this, I learned that I was probably going to want to use cycles to render the animation if I wanted it to really feel like clay. Also, adding a displacement modifier with a cloud texture wasn't going to work as well as I thought it would. In this still image, I was able to just manually sculpt it into the shape that I want, but that wasn't going to work for an animation. Next, I needed to know what I was going to animate, so I made a very simple storyboard. Essentially, the idea was that the character was running away from someone, perhaps the police. I was trying to make a story that was told through as little context as possible, making the audience ask questions. Ultimately, I changed the story by the end, but it was good to have a direction to move in. After quickly designing a character, I moved on to modeling. This was fairly simple. Everything was essentially just a blob, as I was going for a clay look. One part that was more interesting is the hair. I started off with a series of curves, which I then converted into a mesh, then joined them all together by remeshing them. This dense group of vertices is really bad for animation, so after a failed attempt at retopology, I used an external tool called Instant Meshes. It's a free program that retopologizes your mesh automatically. Okay, with that done, it was time to do some texture painting. I'm mostly just using solid colors, so I was able to just use the auto UV unwrapping, and then just got to painting. We can do this by selecting certain faces in edit mode, then in texture painting mode, we just use the fill tool, making sure that the paint mask option is active. Another thing I did was add some blush to the cheeks. This would be difficult with real clay, but I think it adds a little life to the character. Okay, so we have some color there, but it still doesn't look like clay. To change this, we needed to add some displacement. In my style test, we used a displacement modifier, but this would be difficult to animate, which is something we need to achieve this jittery effect. So instead, I added the displacement through the shader editor. This doesn't actually do anything by default, so under the material properties, under settings, under surface, we set displacement to displacement and bump. This means we can actually affect the geometry of the character through the shader editor. Keep in mind that this only works with the Cycles render engine. This displacement method can cause some clipping. To fix this, I just created a new grayscale texture that can be used as a mask controlling the strength of the displacement. Next, we can add some more bump to the character using a bump map. This won't actually affect the mesh like the other displacement, but will affect how light interacts with the surface. This is helpful for much finer texture, adding to the overall realism. Next, I moved on to rigging. This was one of the most complicated 3D rigs that I've ever made, but I found my experience with 2D rigging in Blender has come in handy. After building up the deformation rig or base structure, I started weight painting. I thought that I was going to be able to just select the mesh, select the armature, press Ctrl P and select automatic weights, and it didn't work. An error has come up. After some research, I found out that despite how amazing Blender's automatic weighting is, it doesn't do too well with overlapping meshes, which is something that this character relies on. So, now I have to do the weight painting from scratch. I've never done that before, but I've discovered the gradient tool, which was an absolute lifesaver. Okay, by the time the rest of the rig was done, I had stuffed in a bunch of pretty cool features into a simple character. I have a simple torso rig with stretching, an IK-FK switch for all the limbs, a simple but pretty dynamic face rig, and a stretch control for the hair, hoodie, and head. Finally, the biggest thing that I did was the inverse kinematics foot control. Essentially, I have one control that allows us to pivot the foot from the ankle, ball of the foot, or the sides. I'm really proud of this and I learnt a lot doing it. Okay, with the rig done, it was time for some more testing, in the form of a walk cycle. Here it is, and I'm really happy with it. If you've watched some of my previous videos, you'll know that this is usually where I stop. I love animation, but for some reason, time and time again, I make a character, create a walk cycle, and then move on to the next project. Not this time though, I have a story to tell, although as I hinted earlier, I don't like the story that I've planned, so it's time for a redo. This time, the stop motion character walks onto a desk, sees a little present. Curious, he runs over and picks it up, and then shakes it. Disturbed by what he hears, he throws the box away and runs away as fast as possible. I like the story a lot better. It still has that element of leaving the audience asking questions, but a little more fleshed out. So after rigging up a box and adding everything to a new scene, we could start animating. Changing the keyframe interpolation to constant, I could start blocking out the animation. This first part where he walks onto the scene, I was fairly confident with. It's just a walk cycle along the x-axis of the world. This next part on the other hand, he's running at an angle to the world, something that I've never really done before. But I'm really happy with how this turned out nonetheless. Then he just picks up the box, which I did using a child of constraint. He shakes the box and throws it away. While the box is in the air, I used a technique called space switching to animate the overlapping action of these tassels. Okay, I was running out of time at this point, so I chose not to set this on a desk, but just a purple expanse instead. I quickly threw together some lighting and set it rendering. Finally, I added some sound effects using a mixture of recording my own sounds and sounds from freesound.org. I toyed with the idea of adding music, but looking at popular stop-motion animations on the internet, I found that they tend to avoid music. Looking for that same aesthetic, I chose to do the same. Okay, we're done. I've made a really cool project that I can be proud of, and know that my skill set is expanding. Before we finish off, I want to let you know about some best practices when doing similar projects. Throughout this time, I was receiving regular feedback from my fellow students, my tutor, and my family. This has greatly improved the end result of the project, and it was invaluable. Secondly, documenting the process is incredibly useful, at least I think so. For this assignment, we had to create a documentation PDF as part of the submission. However, starting sometime last year, I fell in love with documentation, and at least for me, it's one of the most effective project management tools. and I've done this for personal projects in the past as well. Okay, so we could end it here, but for those of you who are more interested in 2D, we're going to reproduce this project with grease pencil. We will be using this character, which was the topic of my last tutorial, so go watch that after this video. Before we can get started, the rig needs some adjustments. First, adding the box by drawing it on a new layer and rigging it up. I also made some other adjustments needed for this animation. Finally, with that done, we can start animating. When animating, I tend to start with blocking. This is just describing the motions of the animation with as few poses as possible. Then moving on to breakdown poses. These are poses that further describe the motions, but adding personality. When all of that is done, I could then move on to editing the movement with the graph editor, making sure nothing feels off. Finally, after some lighting effects, it was done, again. So here you have both versions. Enjoy. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time.